I think maybe we could start. You were talking about China. We have two experts here on China. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. Ivar, why does China need to use so much more coal than most other economies?
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, it has a lot to do with the energy demand. But so there are two reasons really. So one is China has a lot of coal, and they don't have that much oil and gas relative to the demand, and also coal was what they had and what was, cheap and realistic to build out when they started their growth in the 2000s. And still, the energy demand is just so high that it's until recently not really been possible to cover the growth with renewables. But also the economy now is so structured around coal, so it's hard to reduce the amount of coal use very quickly now, partly because it's really hard to build any other energy source fast enough to really bring coal down quickly, but also just the whole economy and the electricity grid and the whole structure is centered so much around coal. So that's obviously changing, but still it's difficult to move away from coal quickly.
And Jan, when do you think it will change? When will emissions in China peak?
I mean, that's moving target, or the official target is to peak emissions before 2030. I think that's still achievable, but we might see emissions in the industry sector to peak a bit earlier. But for the power sector, exactly because Ivar's slides has shown the power demand, and also that's also because more electrification, which will also drive up power demand. So on one hand, China has to rely on coal, and especially much more also after the energy crisis, because of then coal is seen as a reliable domestic supply, but also China is building more renewables as well, because renewables really the energy crisis also I think makes every one of us realize is like the energy from the roof of your factory, of your house, is also more secure. So these both tracks will continue to grow, but I think realistically, or for the total emissions around 2030 is still the more likely scenario.
And Glen, when do you think the CO2 emissions overall will peak?
Well, you can split that in. So we were talking about fossil CO2 emissions, and they're still growing. Before COVID, we're actually talking about when will emissions peak in the next few years. But then we had the big COVID drop and the big rebound. So I think we're at the stage where we can start having that discussion again. Are renewables growing fast enough that they will start to compensate and displace some coal in the electricity system, so emissions start to go down? I think it's a little bit too uncertain to say. I'd imagine emissions will just bounce up and down flat a little bit before they start to have a meaningful decline. However, we're talking about fossil emissions, and what matters for the atmosphere is total CO2 emissions. So there's also emissions from land use change, for example, deforestation. Those emissions are actually trending downwards slightly. There's a lot of uncertainty in that. They're about 10% of the total CO2 emissions, with a slight downward but very uncertain trend. And when you add our fossil emissions with the land use CO2 emissions are fairly flat, a slight decline, but a lot more uncertainty. So maybe, depending on what happens in the land use sector, we may see a peak in the total emissions in the next year or two, and then a gradual slight decline, but a lot of uncertainty on that.
And you will be sure to update us on that as we go along. We were talking a bit about renewables in China, and you were mentioning, Robbie, renewables in India and what happened to them, and that it was a big growth, but it's still on a low level. And why didn't they achieve their renewable targets? Or what?
Right, yeah. So I did briefly mention that they fell short of their renewable targets for the end of 2022. So I think the first interesting thing to say is that the targets were very ambitious. And of course, an ambitious target is one that you're not sure that you're going to achieve. right? So it's you've got a lot of uncertainty, and otherwise it's not ambitious. But secondly, I guess into that point is that the ambitious target was set politically and without so much consultation with the technocrats and the experts. So in particular, the 100 gigawatts of solar by the end of 2022, this was the politicians that decided this target. The previous target was 20 gigawatts. This was a much larger number. It was a round number, 100 gigawatts. It sounded great. And so the experts, the technical experts, were asked after the goal was basically set. So this obviously creates a problem with, can we achieve that sort of target? But when you put these sorts of ambitious targets in place, then you need to facilitate that. So there are all sorts of hindrances and problems in the way that you need to get out of the way so that industry can build these things so that the prices are right and so on. I think the other point that I want to raise is then the policy conflict in India. And so there are a lot of other points, but this is an interesting one that India had at the same time a policy of 100 gigawatt solar goal by the end of 2022. So a policy to build as many solar panels as possible, put as many solar panels on the ground as possible. It also had a policy to build up a domestic manufacturing industry in solar panels and solar. And these two are in conflict because when you have a young industry, you want to protect it. So they wanted to build up this industry. The way to protect a young industry is to put tariffs on imports. So they put a 25% tariff on the imports of solar panels from China. That made solar panels much more expensive than they would otherwise have been, which was against the policy target of trying to build out as many solar panels as possible. So this is a typical, every government around the world faces policy conflicts where they've got two policies which are at odds. And in this case, India leaned on the side of building the domestic manufacturing. So potentially this has delayed the implementation of solar in India. Hopefully it hasn't meant a permanent increase in emissions.
Thank you. We now see a question coming in from the audience. It's from Enrico Bernardini, and it says, do you see an increase in E&P investment for fossil fuels or a relative catch-up of investments in renewables? Who wants to?
That's a tough question. Who wants to tackle that one? I'm not sure of the latest statistics on the share of investments going into the fossil sector compared to renewables.
So I think we have seen some consultancies reporting about the investments in the green transition, which is much more than just renewables. It includes electric vehicles and other things, and that has reached $1 trillion now, and we're now at a similar order of magnitude to oil and gas. Of course, there's enormous fluctuation in the investment in oil and gas industry and fossil industry from year to year, but what we're seeing is a fairly steady increase in many categories in the green technology industry over time. So, of course, many are hopeful that trend will continue without too many hiccups along the way, and that will displace the investment in oil and gas. Partial answer.
Thank you. We have another one for you, Robbie. Ingvild Sørhus is saying thank you for the presentation, and that you said that in Europe, part of that you expected a large drop in fossil fuel emissions in 2023. Could you please elaborate?
So I didn't say I expect, I said expectations are. So actually that's Ember, which you're probably familiar with, which is a think tank which focuses on mostly on electricity and particularly on coal. So there's several factors. So one is that in 2022, we saw the very large decline in nuclear generation, and a large part of that was because of maintenance issues in France that we're expecting to roll through, so that most of the capacity will be back online in France in 2023. It's been delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed, and there's been a lot of commentary on that, and the strikes there haven't helped. But that's one big reduction in non-fossil generation that we expect to come back in. A second one is that in 2022, I think Yen mentioned that there was what was called at the time the worst drought in 500 years in Europe, and that led to substantial drops in hydropower generation. And we don't expect 2023 to be such an unusual year, so we expect a recovery of hydropower. And I think the last one is that the solar and wind installation industries are expecting to install about to increase capacity by quite a large amount. The number in my head is 25%, but you can check Ember's report on that. These things combined suggest that the fossil share of generation will drop in 2023.
Thank you, Robbie. I will take one final question before we end for today. And that's from Asbjørn Torvanger, and it's on China. Will China invest in CCS to reduce coal-related CO2 emissions in the power sector?
Do you want to take that, Tin, or I think I can answer it partly, but not. Yeah, and also, I mean, China is already investing in CCS to some extent, but I guess it's more like research and development at this point, not really full-scale deployment. I haven't sort of seen any signs that that's going to be a very big part of it. I mean, part of maybe Ian can fill in on the details there. But one of the challenges with CCS in general is that, as opposed to renewables, is that it kind of just removes a problem. It doesn't add much value in addition to removing a problem. Like renewables gives you more energy and also improves China's position in strategically important industries, whereas CCS is more about just getting rid of the CO2. I mean, there are some industrial benefits, but nowhere near what you get from renewables. But,
yeah, I can agree with Jan, exactly. There are a lot of, regarding CCS or CCUS, there are a lot of pilot projects. So there are good reports published by the Chinese Environment Ministry of CCUS yearbook. That's very good, a very good overview of existing projects. But again, they're mostly pilots. And for the power sector, if we look at them, there are very few of them. And so that's basically not so much compatible with renewables. So we may see a bit more application, let's say, in the industry, in the steel sector, and going forward. But I think it's also from the official outlook, is that it's doing pilot phase, and for it to be, let's say, applicable or commercially viable, not before 2035.
I think with this, we have to wrap it up for today. Look in the camera. That's the camera. So we thank all the excellent speakers and the audience for joining us today. And my colleagues here in the room are following this issue as we move further into 2023. So you'll be sure to hear from them and the project, Force project as well. Later on. Thank you very much.